Hello, everyone. Welcome to another broadcast of the Orthodox Nationalist. This is Matthew Raphael Johnson, and this is being recorded very late, Saturday, May 17th, 2025. My air conditioning may come on. It tends to be a little loud, but it's an absolute necessity. And it's not even that hot, but today we're going to talk about a topic near and dear to my heart, and that is the origins of World War I, but more specifically, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, because this is tied up with the Eastern Crisis, the fate of the Turkish Empire, and the Rothschild family. This is one of the events that set the stage for that disastrous and needless war. World War I, to a great extent, began with the Eastern Crisis. Now, the Eastern Crisis has a very specific definition. That's the Turkish default on Rothschild loans in 1875. But there's other uses of the term. Things that were going on in the Balkans at the time sometimes get thrown in to the Eastern Crisis label. But what happens even when an empire can't pay its bills, and the sources of its loans are all foreign? Well, they are taken over. Russia could have many times over destroyed the Ottoman state and freed the Slavs of the Balkans, creating a unified state, or at least several large ones, which would not have created the problems that they did. But in this case, this is a tale of two treaties. Many of you know them, San Stefano and from the Berlin Congress. Now, the Austrians are to blame for the start of the war, for their invasion of Serbia. But of course, the roots of the crisis go far deeper. The Austrian connection has always been my concern in World War I. But despite them being a central power, those alliances didn't mean very much. Britain and Russia were bitter enemies, despite them being on the same side. For the most part, Austria, to the extent that it fought Russia, despite the fact that it owed its existence to Russia, was an ally of the British. What ultimately happened is that the British artificially maintained the colonial state of the Ottoman Empire of Turkey, ensuring that future wars were inevitable. Now, I've written quite a bit. I have a book on the topic, but just for the sake of the early 19th century, Turkish colonial rule was not pleasant, despite the propaganda to the contrary. Orthodox Serbs and Greeks, under Ottoman control for 4 centuries. When I say Ottoman control, there's a strong Jewish element to it, because Islam and Judaism are very similar. They rose up against their Islamic overlords, and they won. The Serbian Revolution of 1804 to 1817, the Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 29, established new states, unfortunately staffed by the wrong people, and many reforms were forced out of the Ottoman government. The Ottoman Sultan Muhammad II abolished the Janissary Corps in 1826, which was very unpopular, but it was a concession to this new generation of states. The Jews call us Goyim. Well, Muslims called the peasants of the Balkans Raya, and they mean the same thing, cattle. The lower classes, the Raya, especially in the Bosnian section of the Ottoman Empire, experienced very harsh economic conditions. These are Serbs, of course. Now, there is no such thing as a Bosnian ethnicity, but the Muslim lords took far more than half of each peasant's crop annually, besides the taxes on farm products and everything else. Jewish tax farmers, usually from Salonika, levied additional taxes and the remaining, whatever remained. And on top of all that, in 1874, you had a crop failure. Now, most modern history texts, at least in English, serve as apologetics for Islamic imperialism. Now, it's not because they love Muslims so much, it's because they universally support the Jewish view of the world. They were at war with Christianity. Well, for example, one common idea is that Christians were permitted to remain Christians so long as they paid an extra tax. And that's usually followed by an exclamation that Islam was far more progressive than Byzantine Orthodoxy or anything else. And then that's the end of it. We're supposed to forget about it. But we're not talking about an income tax. We're not talking about the sales tax you pay at the register. That's not that kind of a tax. This is something called the jizya. It's usually glossed over, but it was of immense significance. It's certainly not a financial tax. In fact, this was never about money at all. So much of the Orthodox countryside was non-monetized anyway. So what form was this tax taken? The jizya was about submission, not money. We're talking about using the word tax equivocally. And in the Balkans, taxes, quote unquote, were paid in public, where those paying in one form or another had to humiliate themselves in some fashion. The beard was pulled, sometimes palms were smacked around. The payer was just beaten up. The conception here is that one's life is ransomed in cash or something else. It's a form of extortion. The non-Muslim's life is forfeit. Therefore, the jizya is extracted in recompense for it. That's part of why, apart from the sword, that the Islamic expansion was so successful. And don't think that this didn't last right up until the 19th century. And it did. The three important courts, Vienna, Berlin, and Petersburg, they were most directly concerned with the Balkans. The British were only because of the Turkish angle, and then later the Russian angle. 1875, Gulia Andrassy, obviously a Hungarian name, wrote his note, and he pointed out the efforts of the great powers. And with great powers, we mean Britain, France, now Germany, Austria, and Russia. Sometimes not Russia, but. And he was concerned that localizing the revolts in the Balkans wasn't very easy. The rebels were not going to be defeated very quickly. That the Ottoman Turks never followed through on their promises of reform. Those decrees that they laid out, they were just vague statements of principle. They weren't commands to anybody. They were never intended to have any connection to actual policy. It's a very Jewish concept. The Ottoman state would issue or promises concerning various reforms in the Slavic population. And of course, they were concerned about their own popularity as well in the Islamic world. But these were just statements. They weren't commands. So Andrassy thought that this was time for the great powers to press the Ottoman state to fulfill its promises. And we know especially to the Rothschild clan. At this point, they owed a tremendous amount of money. We'll get to that here in a minute. Now, there were some reforms that the Turkish state promised. The recognition, not just the toleration, but the recognition of the Christian population, the abolition of the Jewish tax farmers. Tax farmers would be given a quota, and anything that they were able to extract above and beyond that quota they could keep. That goes back to the Roman Empire. And to eliminate the feudal relationships. to make Christian peasants free proprietors, as I had done in Russia. Going so far as to even in Bosnia have elected councils, judges that were appointed for life, individual liberties of various kinds, commissions of Muslims and Christians working together, and that this was something because the Sultan owed so much money and had been defeated several times in battle. He would be responsible to the rest of the powers. The Sultan wasn't really a power. He was responsible to the great powers to carry this stuff out. So that note of his was, Andalusi note, was adopted. Of course, the point was to take over the Turkish state to ensure prompt repayment and hopefully stop it from collapsing. Now, when it became clear that Russia and Turkey were going to war, Andalusi arranged, well, he, being a professional diplomat, he didn't like a lot to change. He had the feeling the Russians were going to win, despite these loans going to that were taken out starting in the 1850s, going to the Navy and other things. That nothing should occur that would be to the detriment of Austria-Hungary, which would never have been the case. As I've said, 1849, the Hungarian separatists overthrew the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and Russia invaded and reinstalled them. It's that simple. And Russia at the time was a creditor nation. Now, after the Turkish War, the Treaty of San Stefano threatened to do something that the British couldn't abide, that is, Russian domination in the Near East. Then, Andalusi wanted to build this consensus, the German and British especially, even though the Germans and Russians were allies for some time, that everything should be submitted to something called a European Congress, something where the Russians wouldn't nearly have as much. Don't forget the Crimean War, which was certainly not a humiliating defeat for the Russians by any means. It wasn't a victory either, where Russia took on the entire European world, including Turkey, and fought them to a draw. Of course, the Germans weren't included in that. Then after that, the Congress of Berlin, 1878, which was disastrous for Russia, tried to correct all of this. We'll get to this here in a minute. Turkey, at least in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was very... the Magyar elite tended to support the Turks and hated the Russians for reasons I already mentioned. To stop any Russian advance, Bosnia would be taken by Austria-Hungary. And in fact, Andalusi obtained the right to station armies in what's called the Sanjak of Novi Pazar. That's a second level, like an American state or a Canadian province under the Ottoman Empire, the Sanjak. The Sanjaks were lined up. They were very specific. They were to keep Serbia and Montenegro separated and to make sure that Serbia was landlocked. So these weren't arbitrary things. Now, there were Sanjaks elsewhere, but these were very artificial. It preserved the separation of Serbia and Montenegro, and Austro-Hungarian garrisons there would eventually, and this was the plan, to take Salonika, to bring the western part of the Balkans under permanent Austrian influence, as he would say. Now, that wasn't a popular option. The Magyar elite, although for very different reasons from the British, didn't want the Turkish state overthrown. Even though by 1878 it was very, very clear that Turkey was finished. Salonika, don't forget, was the central point for the Balkan Jewish population. Balkan Jews, there were never very many of them. But the ones that existed were in Salonika, a port city, of course, the northern part of Greece. But he signed an alliance with Germany. I think on his last day, 1879, that alliance was going to be deadly, of course. But prior to this, the Russo-Turkish War was of immense significance. it created independent nations in the Balkans, which was an awful thing as far as the Western powers were concerned. There was the Conference of Constantinople in 1876, early 1877. Great Britain, Russia, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Now that had to do with the Serbian uprisings in Bosnia in 1875 and the Bulgarian April uprising in 1876, which were extremely popular, that Russia was going to take advantage of. And Russia did have a strongly idealistic approach to this stuff. It was all over the papers. Alexander II fully agreed with it. They're going to force the Turks to carry out these various reforms. The Turks dug in their heels. Now, it was one thing for them to be supported by the British and actually all of Europe in the Crimean War 20 years earlier, but they didn't get a lot of support in the Russo-Turkish War, largely because of their complete arrogance and transigence when it comes to legitimate Russian demands. There were some bilateral negotiations between the British and the Russians by Count Ignatieff on the political structure of Bulgaria and Bosnia. In fact, there were 9 meetings held without the Ottomans present. And usually what would happen for these conferences, for all of these conferences, you would have a lot of private meetings that would take care of most of the nuts and bolts. The public meetings were a different story. But in the preliminary conferences, they were usually secret, but not always. The great powers were trying to solve the problem in the Balkans, and Slavic Orthodox and independence was a huge problem for them, and not just for the Serbs. And it's not just because the Ottoman Empire owed the British or the Rothschilds a huge amount of money. There was a project that was to create this Bosnian. Now, Bosnian there is no such thing as a Bosnian. Serbia was supposed to receive the lands occupied by Turkey during the War of 1876. Montenegro was to grow as well. The second largest city of Montenegro is Nikšić. Of course, today is in Montenegro. Veliko Brdo, Spuz, so many of these places that are obscure to us, some of which today are part of Albania, but... And I should mention, this is where the idea of Albania began. As far as an Orthodox Albanian, I don't think it makes any sense. Usually when I'm criticizing Albania, which I do all the time, it's like a hobby. I'm referring to either the communists or the Muslims. But Albania began as a union of Islamic landowners that came into existence to prevent Serbia from having an outlet to the sea. The League of Prizren. Actually, it was 47 Ottoman beys or landlords, terrified of the revolutionary situation and the collapse of Turkey, of course, their patron. Quite often, the Muslims of Bosnia backed the incursion of the Austrians because it was something to use against the Serbs. But it was mixed when Austria took Bosnia and Herzegovina and eventually annexed it, which caused nothing but trouble. So you had the new Greek state, you had Serbia, and let's be clear, Serbia and Montenegro, this is the same ethnic group, but they live very different lives because of the topography, keeping them from joining. To this day, the EU has done the same thing. Has been an elite policy for quite a while. And, of course, Bulgaria. Now, the Russians, of course, liked a single Bulgarian autonomous region with an outlet to the Black Sea, of course, Bulgarian part of Macedonia. But Andrassy himself, as well as the British, couldn't handle that either. Now we're going to see here, and many of you probably already know, the Russian victory in the Russo-Turkish War meant that Russian influence in the Balkans was going to grow tremendously. And of course, Turkey would be no more. Remember, the Russians drove the Turks straight to the gates of Istanbul. The Ottomans had separatist, Islamic separatist movements that the Russians often supported all over the place. Muhammad Ali in Egypt, everywhere. They were falling apart. But rather than a unified Bulgaria, they split it in half. We'll see here in a minute that the Turks kind of saw this coming and deliberately sent Muslims to go live there to create a reserve army. They did the same thing in Kosovo. So they tried to create they succeeded for a while in creating two Bulgarias, Rumelia and Bulgaria, but they wanted to limit the size of what they considered a Russian satellite. Eastern province was inhabited at least partly by Turks and Greeks that were not, whether that was true or not, that was just a British excuse, is another matter. But the only thing they cared about was preventing Russia from strengthening its position. The British wanted to block its way to Constantinople and the Straits. Because if you are, far eastern Bulgaria, it's a straight shot right down to Istanbul. Other than the Rothschild debt, it was Russia that concerned the British. Regardless, the reforms of these committees, the governors of both regions, both parts of Bulgaria, were appointed by the Sultan with the consent of the powers for a 5-year term. Again, the Russians just wanted one, and the Russians wanted it elected by the local population. That was also rejected. Each region would have a legislature, an assembly elected by all residents over 25 years with property qualifications, which, by the way, would have eliminated many of the Orthodox Slavs from voting. It would have become an Islamic legislature. There was a regional assembly that would elect a commission with a governor for a term of 4 years. So the way that things were organized there was a canton, roughly 7,500 people, according to their religion. Several cantons form a sanjak, which also has a governor, depending on the population. And that governor usually was appointed by the Sultan. In this case, there was going to be an international supervisory committee to monitor the implementation of these agreements for a year. And there was even going to be a peacekeeping force, 4,000-man escort from either Belgium or Italy. So that was the plan prepared for the conference, submitted to the Sultan, and of course, it was rejected. In fact, everything that the power, even when they were trying to support them, was rejected. Turks presented objections, counterproposals, anything they could do, which of course were rejected by the great powers. And there was no attempt to smooth over differences. And remember, any concessions on the part of the Sultan, in his defense, would have been very unpopular. He had already disbanded the Janissaries. Many thought that he had given too much to the rebellious Slavs. It was actually in 1877, that was Grand Vizier Mirhat Pasha. That was it. They said there's no more talking. And they recalled and the powers recalled their ambassadors from Istanbul. There was one last attempt, the London Protocol, but Turkey refused that as well. That was in March of 1877. Russia now had grounds for war. But Russia had grounds for war anyway because of the treatment of the revolutionaries by the Ottoman Turks. We'll get to that here in a minute. Now I want to talk a bit about the Rothschilds because they have a huge role here Starting in August of 1854, this was during the war in Crimea, the Ottomans entered into a relationship with the Rothschild family, which is never a good thing. They wanted to finance railways, a lot of infrastructure stuff, telegraph. They were very lavish spenders. They had always had huge debt. So by the end, or the last quarter of the 19th century, the Ottoman state became almost a colony of the great powers, specifically Britain. Turkey's debt brought its finances under Western control. Unlike Russia or Serbia, the peasantry in Turkey bore the full brunt of the tax burden, paying those tax farmers and, of course, Jewish moneylenders. Most large-scale agriculture there was controlled by Western capital. So Istanbul, other major coastal cities in Turkey were receiving grain and flour from abroad. Since Britain, controlling the agriculture of Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, exported the entire thing. Foreign capital had a monopoly on the production of Turkish tobacco, controlling whole regions. So foreign capital acted as an organizer of production and created a kind of semi-feudal dependence of peasants as very cheap labor. There were attempts to modernize. Sultan Abdul Hamid II and Mehmed V. So, from 1876 to 1918, you had a lot of natural wealth in that empire, but these were failures. Everything at this point was controlled by foreign companies, usually British and French. So the dependent peasantry was exploited so that foreign businessmen could reap massive profits that never benefited the Turkish treasury or any other treasury. No steel was made. They forced, like they do so many times in the developing world today, the powers forced Turkey to be a raw materials exporting colonial possession. They even created in 1881 the administration of the Ottoman public debt. That's largely a British thing, with some French assistance, because this was a Rothschild matter. They began taking all productive capital out of the Turkish Empire in exchange for as debt repayment. It was mostly British, but there was some French as well. So, at the very latest, by 1908, foreigners were in total control of that empire. They created and replaced the members of the bureaucrats in the Ministry of Finance. Sultan Abdul Hamid II tried to mobilize political Islam against Christians throughout the empire. This was his really his only method of keeping these new states from functioning very well. Now, for World War I, Turkey came under Germany, which took control of its armed forces. The Turkish government tried to use Germany to strengthen the army and its suffering economy to break the monopoly of the British over her resources, but that's the Ottoman state from which the Albanian national movement sought some kind of independence. Albania was a post facto name. It's given to Islamic landlords, as I've already mentioned, seeking to protect themselves from the rage of Christian peasants. It wasn't at the time meant to be an ethnic identity at all. After the First Balkan War, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but Bulgaria and Romania were encouraged to seek any excuse, any reason to invade Serbia, because this was the Russian conduit. Vienna went so far as to create the Albanian nation, which just coincidentally cut Serbia off from Montenegro. So the point is, they had to get their act together because they feared reprisals from the long-suffering Orthodox people of the area. For a while, they tried to be anti-Turkish, but that didn't last long. There was nothing in the Turkish Empire for them to be a part of anymore. It's extremely rare to find an actual authority that doesn't admit the purely opportunistic creation of this Albanian nation. I want to quote from Zickel and Iwaski, their book in 1994. One of Serbia's primary war aims was to gain an Adriatic port, preferably Durrës. Austria-Hungary and Italy opposed giving Serbia an outlet to the Adriatic, which they feared would become a Russian port. They insisted They instead supported the creation of an autonomous Albania. There was no notion of an Albania, really. Those who created the Treaty of San Stefano, which was the true treaty that came after the Russo-Turkish War, that's what created the independent states on the ruins of the Turkish Imperium, took that land and divided it among the victors, especially the Bulgarians and Serbs. But a generation earlier, the Prizren League foresaw this and was created, claimed an autonomous status from a dying Turkey. Later on, that was called Albania. The chairman was a French-based landlord, Abdul Bey Fashiri. The initial ideology of this group was presented in something called the Kariname, like a constitution, or more like a declaration of independence. Albanian leaders emphasized their intention to preserve and maintain the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire by supporting the Sultan, which is odd, but to struggle in arms to defend the wholeness of the territories of Albania. So they weren't quite sure if they wanted independence or not. It really depended. The, quote, rights of the Albanian nation were nothing more than an oligarchy afraid of the Serbs would deprive them of their serfs. The concept of that country simply referred to the desire to maintain the Ottoman state in the Balkans. But the Kariname never even mentioned independence or autonomy, or only the creation of this Islamic unit called Albania. Otto von Bismarck said the same thing. He called it a geographic idea and nothing more. It's not an ethnic category. It existed solely to give some legal foundation to stop the loss of territory to the Orthodox Slavs. However, given the circumstances, the great powers saw the League as a way to extend their own power, the Ottoman power, against the Slavs. The great powers ordered Turkey to use military force to place the League under control, which, by the way, gave the Turkish armies another excuse to remain in the Balkans. But eventually, because of that pressure, because of that action, the Islamic oligarchy had no choice but to demand autonomy from a failing Ottoman state. But they still received weapons and financing from Turkey. And there was no claim to any ethnic connection at the time. In fact, most of the delegates of the League were under the impression Prizren was, they thought that their name was a League of Real Muslims, or the League of True Muslims. Others were convinced that it was just an economic organization of local landlords. Fashiri wanted the group at one point to be called the Central Committee for Defending Albanian Rights, but everyone just called it the Istanbul Committee anyway. So, at the very most, Albania was used by locals to refer to those areas that had an Islamic majority, and nothing more. No conception of a nation was offered or exist until the British and the Austrians realized it was usable. There's no separate alphabet. There's no Albanian schools. You know, it's one of the big things that every other ethnic group in the Balkans was doing. This explosion of ethno-nationalism. It's an extraordinary thing. We all know about the, what Constantinople had to say about that. In their the robber synods that condemned nationalism, the Philotism nonsense. But very suspiciously, the Prizren League followed British directives on every major and minor issue of foreign policy. Standing against Russian influence, that was their use. Not to mention the independence of the Slavs and Romanians. But once the Russian Empire pushed the tottering Turkish state almost to nothing, the powers had to scramble to find a suitable substitute. Without any architectural evidence or anything like that, or anything other than the descendants of Serbs or Greeks who were forced to convert to Islam, Albania exists solely to frustrate Serbian and hence Russo-Bulgarian aims in the 20th century Balkans. Albania was to Vienna in 1912 the creation of a local alliance to destroy Serbia once and for all. The governor of Bosnia, Benjamin Kale, invented another nation, Bosnia. If you read a lot of Gogol like I have, his life reads like a character from a Gogolian character. Bureaucratic, petty, company man. Calais proved the comparison correct by banning his own book on Serbia, which at one point was considered favorable to Serbian aspirations. So he had to ban his own book. The Treaty of Berlin, which replaced the Treaty of San Stefano, of course, was a disaster. It was designed to permit the empire to neutralize the nationalist movement among Bosnian Serbs. Croatia then approached Vienna, demanding greater autonomy in exchange for war with Serbia. Vienna then began arming Croats and Muslims in Bosnia. And all of this, of course, exploded into the Balkan Wars, and the Treaty of Bucharest in 1913 led to a completely prostrate Serbia, easily bullied by Vienna. The Western invention of Albania to control Serbia is one example of this policy. A historian by the name of Vickers, one of the main authorities in early Albanian history, he was a contemporary, actually. This is what he says. The Albanian national idea still had to compete with tribal particularism. Christian Albanians were united primarily in their intense mistrust and dislike of Ottoman rule. The predominantly Muslim Kosovars were conservative by nature and identified themselves religiously with the Ottomans. The Southern Orthodox Christians, for their part, were heavily influenced by Greece, many of their notables desiring union with Greece. Now, the only conclusion you could take from this is that there is no Albanian national idea. This nation, we're told by one of the earliest major authorities at the time, he tells us it's a composite of conservative Islamic groups supporting the Sultan, but the Orthodox who hated the Sultan mostly wanted union with Greece. And there's a smattering of Catholics, I guess, looking west as well. No other nation has this absurd ahistorical beginning. However, I could talk about Albania all day, but we're talking about the Islamic movement. But the loans taken out by Turkey, the Eastern crisis, were spent on the Navy. The Ottoman Navy actually had 200 warships, the third largest naval fleet in the world. But they had no conception of a budget. Then you had a drought. I mentioned this in Anatolia in 1873, flooding in 1874. This caused tremendous discontent. The taxes could not be raised, and this is when the Ottoman government declared or defaulted. October 30th, 1875. 1875, the Ottomans owed something like 214 million British pounds. That would be the equivalent of 26 billion today. But the entire income of the empire was just 22 million pounds yearly. But the result of all this was the Russo-Turkish War. And, Russia did lose certain areas after the Crimean War, very minor, but they fixed all that with the Russo-Turkish War. But it worried the pathologically Russophobic British. The aim of the war proclaimed by Russia, and this should be taken at its word, the freedom of the Orthodox Slavs from Turkish rule, and the expansion of the territory of independent Serbia, as well as the creation of an independent Bulgaria. If Russia pushed the Ottoman state to its death, then no debt repayments would be possible. Not to mention the British may lose these markets. It would have been the end of the Ottoman Empire. Now, Russia entered the conflict with Turkey after the irregulars were already fighting. The Turkish reprisals against rebellions were bizarrely nasty, more than you would even think. But in the autumn of 1876, the Turks had 6 times the number of regulars and irregulars. You had volunteers from Russia going over there. You had Serbs. Russians then, to keep them from being destroyed, issued an ultimatum. And the Turks agreed. It didn't matter because the Turkish state, at least when it came to the Balkans, never kept their word on anything. So that's when Alexander II declared war on Turkey, April of 1877. We need to keep this in mind. The Paris Peace Treaty after the Crimean War had a lot of the same things that we've already mentioned. It obligated the Ottoman Empire to grant equal rights for Christians and Muslims. But again, they would issue these things and nothing would happen. The courts still didn't accept evidence from non-Muslims against Muslims. So there was no question of juridical protection. In my Daily Nationalist, I've talked about the Druze, the Gnostic Druze, very pro-Israeli, massacred 10,000 Christians in Lebanon in 1860 with the support of the Ottoman authorities. Maronites, Unionists, and Orthodox. The only thing that kept that from going on was the threat of French military intervention. Then the uprising in Crete, 1866 to 1869, seeking the unification of the island with Greece. There were 5 cities. There were some Muslims there. 5 cities that the Muslims had kind of locked themselves in. But the uprising was suppressed, but the Sultan made concessions, including self-government, and including the rights of the Orthodox on their own island. But the suppression there was nastier than normal. The Arcadia Monastery. 700 women and children taking refuge behind its walls actually preferred to blow up the powder magazine rather than surrender to the besieging Turks, knowing full well what would happen. I'm not so sure this is a dishonorable suicide in this case. For the first time, I think ever, the press, especially the British press, was doing the right thing because the British wanted so badly to hate, to support the Turks. But this was indefensible. Now, the Russian diplomatic head, Alexander Gorchakov, under Alexander II, starting in 1856, he looked to Germany as a natural alliance. I've talked about this before. Russia was the only power that took a benign, neutral position for the unification of Germany. The only power that essentially backed it. France was in trouble after the Franco-Prussian War, crushing defeats there. Still, in 1870, Russia announced that it's not going to comply with any restrictions on naval construction in the Black Sea. And that's when Bismarck came to Russia's assistance in 1871. And they canceled the Paris Treaty, essentially. If there was any conflict with Russia, and only if there was any conflict with Russia, Article 8 of that treaty gave Great Britain and Austria the right to intervene on the side of the Turks. So Russia had to be very careful. As I mentioned, they had to wait for the right time. There were so many reasons that the British and the Rothschilds wanted the Ottoman Empire to remain. It had received tremendously, the British capital was heavily invested thanks to the Treaty of Bot-Liman, 1838. Not just for the debt to the Rothschilds, but most of the economy was foreign and British. But Britain wasn't going to do it alone. France was annihilated in 1871. So they had to concentrate their forces against Germany. Turkish troops committed mass murder of the civilian population after these uprisings. Because there were no Janissaries anymore, the irregular units were called the Basibazouks. They were mostly Albanian. They were particularly savage. And this is why I say the media actually did the right thing for once. Yes, some of it was propaganda. That's very true. Some of it was exaggerated. That's always true. But in general, they were correct. The government of Disraeli wanted to pursue a pro-Turkish line. The media, especially the opposition Daily News, ripped them. You are ignoring what's going on there. There are Christians of all types over there. An American journalist, Januarius McGann, was a writer there. 1876, Disraeli was put on the defensive in the House of Commons. The British ambassador to Constantinople was lying about a lot of this, Henry Elliot. Now, he was eventually elevated to the House of Lords so he can get out of this, but Disraeli was isolated. One of the few times the media did something good and exposed something that absolutely had to be exposed. And this is what created this wave of indignation all throughout Europe. You had people of every background, Darwin, Victor Hugo. The Bulgarians were being slaughtered to the point where Victor Hugo at least thought that they were being exterminated. Despite the Turcophile policy of Disraeli and Britain in general, it couldn't last. There was a book published, The Bulgarian Horrors and the Question of the East, in 1876. That was Gladstone's. It's more of a booklet. That was the main factor in England's non-intervention on Turkey's side when Russia declared war. And it actually set out a program for granting autonomy to Bosnia and Bulgaria. That's why the movement in Russia was so popular for the Slavic struggle. All social strata. I mean, liberal circles, like the liberation goals of the war, but for the most part, your Slavophiles like the capture of Constantinople and the Slavic Federation, etc. July and August 1876, the Serbian army, as I mentioned already, was in trouble. They needed mediation. They forced the one month truce on them. Sultan Murad V was overthrown August 31st, 1876, and Abdul Hamid II took the throne. Russia was always trying to negotiate, in this case with Austria and England, on a peaceable settlement. But this was out of the question. Russia proposed the occupation of Bulgaria by Russian troops and the introduction of a full united flotilla of the great powers on the Sea of Marmara. So once the armistice with Serbia and Bulgaria expired, Serbia's position was critical. This is when Count Ignatieff presented the Sultan with an ultimatum. This is when Alexander II delivered his famous speech in the Kremlin. 20 divisions were mobilized. Eventually, the Sultan had to accept the Russian ultimatum. Russia concluded an agreement with Austria guaranteeing their neutrality. And they permitted, I think this was a mistake, but they permitted them the right to occupy Bosnia. The so-called Reichstag agreement, mostly secret. So the Constantinople Conference ended without result in 1877. Ignatieff said, you are responsible if we have to attack you here to support Serbia and Montenegro. You are planning on annihilating them. The Turks rejected all forms of compromise. No matter, even the British were bending over backwards to try to find excuses to intervene to support them. They couldn't in this case. So, April of 1877, Russia declared war on Turkey. Now, this is probably the first time the time factor is very important. Only a quick blitzkrieg, one campaign to smash what was left of Turkey. That's what gave Russia the opportunity to avoid any kind of European intervention. The first time the time factor actually played a role like this. London needed 14 weeks to prepare an army of 60,000 and even more time to prepare any kind of landing. They had to be transferred by sea. In May of 1877, Russian troops entered Romania. Of course, Romanian army was a part of this as allies with the Russians. Russia had nothing but allies, in fact, but the Albanians. The Russian army was far superior to the Turks. Russian artillery was exceptional compared to the Turks. There was a complete rearmament Russia had made strides in rifled artillery. So you had the peoples of Transcaucasia, the Balkans. Russian troops had very high morale. Bulgarian, Armenian, Georgian militias, Serbian, Romanian, Montenegrin. You had a very substantial force here. Now, at the time, the Black Sea was dominated by the Turkish fleet. This is something else the Rothschilds paid for. We talked about their right to build the fleet there, to ignore the Treaty of Paris. That was only in 1871. They hadn't done much until then. So the Russian army had to be supplied by land. There were two obstacles on the way to Constantinople. The Danube, and the Turkish bank of it, was fortified. The four fortresses, Rothschild, Shumla, Varna, Silistria, they were the most advanced fortresses in Europe at the time, if not the world. Not to mention surrounded by swamps. The other one was 17 armored monitors, that is to say, armored ships on the Danube, also paid with Rothschild money, which were designed to withstand artillery and coastal guns, making the crossing of the river fairly complex. So the war plan, the army very quickly to cross the Danube, a section where the Turks didn't have fortresses, Nikopol area, an area populated by Bulgarians and Romanians, very friendly to Russia. And the army would be divided three ways. The first would block the Turkish fortresses in the lower reaches of the river. The second would act against Turkish forces in the city of Vidin. And the third would cross the Balkan Mountains and go to Constantinople. Well, the war was a major victory for Russia. All of this worked out. This was a watershed in the independence of every Balkan state and even states around it. Greece, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania. The Turkish Danube flotilla was neutralized, which I also thought was interesting. The Russian artillery was just that much better. And they also used minefields. This was a pretty innovative war. But it wasn't just a Russian victory. The Greek government announced on January 21st that the Greek army was invading Turkish Thessaly, without declaring war, by the way. They'd start taking more territory. I mean, the Russians had come very close to destroying the Turkish Empire entirely. Yet the Turks had irregular detachments, well, so did everyone else. Orthodox irregulars expelled the Turks from all over the place. The Turks would lock themselves into these fortresses. And unfortunately, it was only under pressure from the British in particular that these troops were eventually recalled. And the Highlanders, with the support of rebelled in Abkhazia. Abkhazia eventually was occupied by the Turks, but they were driven out of it. And of course, Armenia. Armenian regions went to Russia, considered Russia as their only hope for deliverance against their Turkish overlords. Russian troops that entered Erzurum in the western part of today's Turkey were greeted as liberators. The Armenian population provided every possible support to the Russian army. All of these groups had their own militias. By the way, the boats of the armed steamship, the Grand Duke Constantine, carried out the first successful torpedo attack in the history of the world, January 26, 1878, on a Turkish patrol steamer. Now, despite the Russian victory, Russia didn't want to get into another Crimean situation. This was the problem. Now, the Treaty of San Stefano was the proper treaty. San Stefano was a western suburb of Constantinople. And February 19, 1878, just between Russia and the Ottoman Empire that ended the war, it was of the utmost importance for the liberation of the Balkan peoples from the Ottomans. The Russians had driven the Turks to the gates of Constantinople. Russia had conquered almost the entire European part of the Ottoman Empire. And the only reason Constantinople wasn't taken was the intervention of the British. Both France and Britain sent their fleets in a threatening way. So the victory of the Treaty of Stanzafano wasn't going to last, unfortunately. The treaty was signed by, of course, Ignatieff and the group from Turkey. And this recognized the independence of Serbia, Montenegro, Wallachia, Moldavia. The territories were expanded. Bosnia formed an autonomous region. And Bulgaria was created. A very large one. Thrace, Macedonia, Moesia, from the Danube to the Aegean Sea. It was to be under Russian military rule for 2 years. Then it would receive full autonomy. It would pay a nominal tribute to Turkey. So not only was Turkey in debt to the Rothschilds, now they had to pay 1.4 billion rubles in contributions to the Russians and others. And a lot of that was through territorial concessions. Cities on the Black Sea, Kars today in Turkey, both sides of the Black Sea, in fact, Batum and Dobruja. There was some compensation, as I mentioned, and the British weren't pleased. And Turkey was forced to strictly observe a lot of this. European powers were enraged. Great Britain and Austria wanted to prevent at all costs Russia from getting any access to the Mediterranean via Bulgaria. In exchange for Cyprus, Great Britain granted Turkey full protection. Otherwise, it would have collapsed entirely. That's the only reason that the Ottoman Empire lasted longer than 1878. I want to mention Armenia again. I should have continued there. Without external intervention, Armenians realized that they were living on borrowed time. The Armenian question arose for the first time in the Stanzafano peace treaty arguments, because the Turkish reforms didn't mean anything. They were always never implemented. The Armenians were treated worst of all. Systematic extermination, unfair taxation, plunder. The Turkish irregulars, and that would include the Kurds and Albanians, lived off booty. They didn't have, they weren't paid. Educated in Russia, many of these people became nationalists. The Kurds were a part of this. These were the robbers, almost an arm of Turkey against the Armenians. The Kurds were always the problem. So according to Article 16, the Sultan was obligated to carry out reforms in the Armenian areas and provide security guarantees, and to stop the rage from the Kurds. The Russian army is going to remain in these regions until the emperor was convinced of the sufficiency of the measures taken. They were going to force Turkey to do this. But under enormous pressure from Great Britain, they had no problem with the slaughter of Armenians or anyone else. They'll sacrifice it. And Austria too, most unfortunately. There was a secret convention, a Cyprus Convention, the Anglo-Turkish Treaty, a defensive alliance directed against, of course, Russia, signed in June of 1878. Great Britain said, by force of arms, we're going to assist you if the Russians expand anymore, especially with support of the Armenians and Georgians and everyone else, Transcaucasia, but also everyone else in the Balkans. The island became a British protectorate. Cyprus became a British protectorate. The British took the island. They paid like £100,000 to the treasury. Formerly, it continued to be a part of the Ottoman Empire. The Muslims only made up 20% of the population, but power just went to the British, and eventually it was annexed. It became a full colony. Disraeli was very, very, very much thought that Cyprus was central to protecting the gateway to India. And Gladstone, of course, was a very different story. Everything came crashing down at the Berlin Congress, and then, of course, the Berlin Treaty. This was essentially the same coalition, the Crimean War, just kind of without the Ottomans, really. And the point was of the Berlin Congress and the Berlin Treaty was to overthrow the Treaty of San Stefano. The national liberation of the Slavic peoples in the Balkans was now in danger. Russia was in no position to start a new war against this massive coalition. They fought Europe once already, and Germany could not be counted on here. In a private conversation, the Russian ambassador to Germany, Bismarck, recommended telling them to discuss the terms of the treaty at a Congress. St. Petersburg was forced to recognize the treaty, unfortunately. Alexander II did order 20,000 men stationed in Turkestan to move to Afghanistan, near Kabul. It was a mission headed by a General Stolitov, who created an alliance with one of the emirs of Afghanistan, Sher Ali, even possibly an invasion of Kashmir. But that pressure possibility didn't change the British mind. It was a smart move, but they didn't care. They didn't really care what had to happen. San Stefano could not continue. It was Chancellor Bismarck who chaired this. Of course, it was in Berlin. And again, most of the important issues were already taken care of in advance. You had Lords Beaconsfield, Julian Andresi, Wuchakov. And most of the issue was really about Bulgaria. And to a lesser extent, Bosnia. Bismarck tried to be a neutral mediator, but Bulgaria ended up being divided in three ways. A vassal principality from the Danube to the Balkans, Bulgarian lands to the south of the Balkans, and then eastern Rumelia, and then Macedonia. So they just made everything far more complicated. Now, I need to mention something here. It was not unforeseen. Roughly around 1855, the population of the Danube regions underwent tremendous change. The Ottoman government settled more than 300,000 Crimean Tatars and other Muslims on the territory to serve as a reserve army against any kind of Christian revolution. The Tatars in Nogais, about 142,000 in 1855, and the second one of 35,000 Circassian, almost 175,000 settlers arriving in 1864. Circassian family. So around 10% of the total population, almost half the Muslims in these regions, were non-natives. They were either refugees or colonists, had arrived only a few years earlier, at the time the war broke out. And they were carefully picked, they were carefully chosen by the Ottomans to increase so these were stronger, these were military men. These had some wealth. It cost them a fortune to do this. Was able to cordon off Bulgaria. This was a war, and these were activated after the Treaty of San Stefano. Thrace and Albania did remain under Turkish control for a while. There was some local government reforms. They accepted Montenegro, Serbia, and Romania as independent again. Montenegro couldn't have ships anymore. That was transferred to Austria-Hungary. Serbia did grow a little, but unfortunately Bulgaria was chopped up, essentially partitioned. Austria occupied Bosnia to place garrisons between Serbia and Montenegro, as I mentioned, the Sanjak and Novi Pazar, which remain under Turkey. Nothing good will follow from this. the so-called freedom of navigation on the Danube from the Black Sea to Constantinople was guaranteed, which was another way of saying British naval dominance. Russia didn't have the time to build their naval fleet in the Black Sea yet. Russia had to introduce a free trade port in Batumi and Kars, although they did get southern Bessarabia. But a lot of this wasn't really enforced. Local government reforms promised by Turkey, again, never happened. Bulgaria and Eastern Rumelia united essentially in 1885 anyway, and they were to continue that later on. Russia abolished the port in Batum in 1886. However, Austria did turn the occupation of Bosnia into an annexation. So, what's going on here? Russia was deprived of her unifying role in the Balkans. Now, of course, warfare and conflict was always going to be there. But if Russia had its way and the Treaty of San Stefano functioned properly and Turkey was pretty much no more, or a bad memory, it would not have been the slaughter that we know. By depriving Russia of her unifying role in the Balkans, more wars were absolutely assured. Russia could have ended Turkish colonialism forever. But the power stopped it. Russia never dismembered France after the defeat of Napoleon. They sought an honorable peace. Russia rescued England from Napoleon in 1812. Rescued England from the Germans many times in World War I. Engaging in offensives before they were ready, because the British needed it. Restoring the Austrian monarch to the throne in 1849 after the Hungarian separatists overthrew him. Russia intervened to protect the Balkan Slavs many times. For everyone, including the Greeks, of course. Russian foreign policy doesn't have anything to answer for. But at every turn, the British sought for its own gain. Russia could have prevented further wars. The Ottoman states still owed Britain a huge sum and could still be used to halt Russia. Her wretched existence was artificially extended. We see this in Ukraine today. Even her protection over the Georgians and Armenians was a big problem for London. Handing back chunks of Bulgaria to Turkey was unconscionable. Of course, the threat of a new Crimean War would begin, this time with the Germans as a possible combatant. A few years later, the British will do the exact same thing with Japan, building them up against Russia. Yeah, World War I began because of Austrian arrogance towards the Serbs. Russia was allied with Britain only because the British wanted Germany harmed. But that alliance only damaged Russia. Albion despised Russia, her system of government, and of course, because Britain was very much a Rothschild dynasty fief, they invented all these stories about pogroms and everything else in the press. We're talking about that in the Solzhenitsyn. If you've tuned into that, how the British was always, pressuring Russia about anti-Semitism. Didn't see them as civilized. But had Russia continued its civilizing mission, it's very possible that the revolution may not have occurred. It's very possible that World War I may not have occurred. That's the story of the Eastern Crisis, as far as I can see it. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.